The funeral was small. 37 people in a chapel that could hold 200, most of them neighbors who barely knew Michael Thompson beyond his quiet nods and the way he kept his lawn perfectly trimmed. His son David sat in the front row, dry-eyed, staring at the simple casket with mixture of relief and residual anger that surprised even him. The pastor spoke about forgiveness, about complicated relationships, about how we never truly know the burdens others carry. David barely listened. He'd heard enough platitudes over the years, enough excuses for why his father had been absent even when he was sitting right there in the living room, staring at nothing, lost in whatever thoughts kept him awake most nights. Michael Thompson was a quiet man, the pastor continued, a man who kept his struggles private, who faced his demons with dignity. David almost laughed out loud. Dignity? His father had spent the last 20 years of his life jumping at loud noises, drinking himself to sleep most nights, and avoiding any conversation that went deep in the weather or the Detroit Lions' latest disappointing season. When David had asked about military service, just once, when he was 12, his father had shut down completely, walked outside, and didn't come back inside for 3 hours. That was the day David decided his father was a coward. The theory made sense, explained everything. Why Michael never talked about his time in the Army. Why he flinched at fireworks. Why he'd never held down a job for more than 6 months, always finding excuses to quit when things got stressful. Why he'd been such a disappointment to David's mother, who divorced him when David was 15 and moved to Phoenix with barely a backward glance. He probably never even saw combat. David had told his wife Sarah just last week when the hospital called to say his father had suffered a massive heart attack. He was probably a desk jockey who couldn't handle the pressure. Some people just aren't cut out for service. Sarah had suggested they visit. Try to reconcile before it was too late. David had refused. Some wounds were too deep, some disappointments too fundamental. His father had been a broken man, and David had spent 35 years being ashamed of that fact. Now, as they lowered Michael Thompson into ground under a gray October sky, David felt nothing but emptiness. No grief, no regret, just a hollow satisfaction of being done with a relationship that had never really existed in the first place. The house on Maple Street looked smaller than David remembered. He'd driven past it countless times over the years. It was only 20 minutes from his own home in the suburbs, but he hadn't been inside since his high school graduation. His father had invited him over for holidays, for birthdays, for no reason at all. David had always found excuses. Sarah insisted on coming with him. "You shouldn't have to do this alone," she said, even though David had made it clear he viewed cleaning out his father's house as nothing more than a chore, like taking out the trash or cleaning the gutters. "It won't take long," he told her as they stood on the front porch. He didn't have much. The key was under the fake rock by the front steps, exactly where it had been for 20 years. Some things never changed. Inside, the house was clean but sparse. The furniture looked like it had been purchased in 1985 and never replaced. The kitchen was immaculate, though the refrigerator contained only essentials: milk, bread, eggs, and 3 cans of Budweiser. The living room featured a worn recliner facing an old television, with a small side table holding a lamp, reading glasses, and a stack of library books, military histories, mostly, which struck David as oddly ironic. He kept everything so neat, Sarah observed, running her finger along a spotless bookshelf. He had plenty of time to clean, David replied curtly. Not like he was busy with a career or anything. They worked methodically through the house. David's approach was efficient and unsentimental. Keep anything with clear monetary value. Donate clothes and household items. Throw away everything else. He felt no attachment to his father's possessions, no curiosity about the life that had been lived within these walls. It was Sarah who noticed the basement door. "We should check down there, too," she said. "There might be important papers, or it's probably just junk." David cut her off. "Storage stuff. We can have the state sale people deal with it." But Sarah was already opening the door, flicking on the light switch. The wooden stairs creaked as she descended, and after a moment, David heard her sharp intake of breath. "David," she called up, her voice strange. "You need to come down here." He sighed and followed her down the narrow stairs. The basement was finished but showed its age. Wood paneling, low ceiling. The faint smell of must have permeated old houses. But what caught his attention immediately was how organized everything was. Shelves lined the walls, each one labeled and arranged with military precision. Christmas decorations, tax records, old photo albums. And in the far corner, a metal filing cabinet that looked like it had been purchased from military surplus. Sarah was standing in front of a wall David hadn't noticed from the stairs. As he got closer, he realized why she called him down. The wall was covered with photographs. Dozens of them, all in matching frames, all featuring men in military uniforms. Desert camouflage. Most of them, the digital pattern that meant Iraq or Afghanistan. Some were formal portraits. Others were candid shots of soldiers in what was clearly a combat zone. And in many of them, David recognized a face he hadn't seen in 20 years. His father, but younger, stronger, wearing the confident expression of a man who knew exactly who he was and what he was doing. "I don't understand," David said slowly. "He told me he never deployed. He said he was stateside the whole time." Sarah was studying one of the larger photographs more closely. "Look at this one," she said quietly. The photo showed a group of 8 soldiers standing in front of what looked like a bombed-out building. They were covered in dust and looked exhausted, but they were smiling. His father was in the center, his arm around a much younger soldier who couldn't have been more than 19. At the bottom of the frame, someone had written in careful block letters, "Bravo Company, 2nd Platoon, Ramadi 2005, after the school." Ramadi, Sarah said, that was one of the worst areas in Iraq. I remember seeing it on the news. David stared at the photo, trying to reconcile the confident soldier in the image with the broken man he'd known. It felt like looking at a stranger. That's when Sarah noticed the filing cabinet was unlocked. "David," she said, pulling open the top drawer. "There's more." The drawer was full of documents, all organized in manila folders with labels written in the same careful block letters as the photo caption. Deployment orders, medical records, commendations, correspondence. Sarah pulled out the commendations folder and opened it. Inside were certificates, awards, and official military documents that David couldn't fully understand but recognized as important. Bronze Star, Army Commendation Medal, Combat Infantry Badge, and at the very bottom, in a frame wrapped carefully in tissue paper, a Purple Heart. David's hands were shaking as he unwrapped it. The metal was heavier than he'd expected. The purple ribbon somehow more vivid than he'd imagined. There was a citation with it, typed on official letterhead. "For wounds received in action against an enemy of the United States while serving with Bravo Company, 2nd Battalion, 28th Infantry Regiment, in Ramadi, Iraq, on March 15, 2005. Staff Sergeant Michael J. Thompson displayed exceptional courage under fire when his unit came under attack, while providing security for a school reconstruction project. Despite receiving serious injuries from an improvised explosive device, Staff Sergeant Thompson continued to direct his men to safety and personally carried 2 wounded soldiers to the evacuation point. His actions undoubtedly saved lives and reflect great credit upon himself, the 28th Infantry Regiment, and the United States Army." David read the citation 3 times before the words began to make sense. His father hadn't been a coward. He'd been a hero. Sarah had moved to another folder labeled Medical Records. She was reading quietly, her face growing pale. "David," she said finally, "you need to see this." The medical records told a story David had never known. Traumatic brain injury from the IED blast. Severe PTSD. Chronic pain from shrapnel that couldn't be safely removed. A recommendation for medical retirement that his father had declined, choosing instead to finish his 20-year commitment despite his injuries. But it was a psychiatric evaluation from 2007 that hit David like a physical blow. Patient continues to experience severe survivor's guilt related to his actions during the March 15, 2005 incident. Despite saving multiple lives and being recognized for his heroism, Patient feels he failed his men and expresses a belief that his family would be better off not knowing about his experiences. Patient has specifically requested that his military records and commendations not be shared with family members. stating that he does not want his son to see him as damaged goods. Recommend continued therapy and family counseling, though patient has declined both. The room was silent, except for the sound of David's father's old furnace cycling on. Sarah was crying quietly, but David felt numb, hollowed out, like someone had reached inside his chest and removed something essential. In the correspondence folder, they found letters, dozens of them, all addressed to Michael Thompson, all from military addresses. David opened one at random. Sergeant Thompson, I wanted you to know that Kevin made it through surgery and is going to be fine. The doctors said if you hadn't gotten him to the medics so fast, he wouldn't have made it. I know you blame yourself for what happened, but you saved his life. Man, you saved all our lives. Kevin wants to name his baby after you. I hope that means something to you. Tony Martinez, formerly PFC Martinez, Bravo Company. Another letter, dated just 2 years ago. Mike, still thinking about you every year on March 15th. I know you don't want to hear it, but you're the reason I'm alive today to walk my daughter down the aisle next month. I wish you'd let us honor you properly, but I understand why you don't want the attention. Just know that the 8 of us who made it home that day never forgot what you did. James Wilson, Captain Rhett. David sank into an old folding chair that his father had apparently used for reading down here. On the small table beside it were more books, not the military histories from upstairs, but self-help books about PTSD, about dealing with trauma, about rebuilding relationships. Books that had clearly been read and reread, with pages dog-eared and passages highlighted. He tried, Sarah said softly, looking at the books. He was trying to get better. David picked up one of the books. Inside the front cover, in his father's handwriting, was a note. For David, when you're ready to understand. Love, Dad. That's when David finally broke down. The crying started as a slow leak and became a torrent. 35 years of anger and disappointment and shame came pouring out all at once, along with the devastating realization of how wrong he'd been, how cruel, how blind. His father hadn't been a coward. He'd been carrying the weight of 8 men's lives, the guilt of surviving when others didn't, the pain of injuries that would never fully heal. And he'd done it all in silence because he thought it would protect his son from seeing him as broken. Sarah held him while he cried, surrounded by the evidence of a man's heroism and a father's love that David had been too proud and too stubborn to see. Later, after David had composed himself enough to continue reading, they found the folder labeled for David. Inside was a letter, sealed but not mailed, addressed to his son in his father's careful handwriting. David's hand shook as he opened it. David, if you're reading this, I'm gone, and you're probably cleaning out my house thinking I was a failure and a coward your whole life. I can't blame you for that. I chose to let you think that rather than burden you with the truth of what I did and what it cost me. I was a good soldier once. I did things I was proud of and things that haunt me still. I saved lives and I watched good men die. I came home with medals I didn't want and wounds that never healed, and I made the choice to carry that weight alone, because I thought it would keep you from having to carry it too. I was wrong about a lot of things, but I was especially wrong about you. You're stronger than I ever was. You built a good life, married a good woman, became the kind of man I always hoped you'd be. You did that without me, which proves you never needed me to be a hero. You just needed me to be your father, and I failed at that. I kept everything down here, because someday I hoped I'd be brave enough to tell you the truth. I hoped we'd sit together and I'd explain why I couldn't talk about the war, why I jumped at loud noises, why I couldn't be the father you deserved. I hoped you'd understand that the man you saw as weak was really just tired from fighting battles you couldn't see. I know it's too late now, but I want you to know that every day I didn't call you, every holiday I spent alone, every year that passed without us talking, it wasn't because I didn't love you. It was because I loved you too much to burden you with my damage. You don't have to forgive me. You don't have to be proud of me. But I want you to know that in a bombed-out school in Ramadi, Iraq, I saved 8 American soldiers, and the proudest moment of my life wasn't when they gave me a medal for it. It was when one of those soldiers told me he was going home to see his son. I thought about you every day I was over there. I thought about you every day I was home. You were my reason for staying alive when I didn't want to, my reason for fighting when I didn't think I could. I'm sorry I couldn't be the father you needed. I'm sorry I couldn't be the man you could be proud of. But I hope someday you'll understand that everything I did, including pushing you away, was because I loved you more than my own life. Your father, Michael Thompson, Staff Sergeant, United States Army, Bravo Company, 2nd Battalion, 28th Infantry Regiment. David read the letter twice, then carefully folded it and put it back in an envelope. The basement was quiet except for the distant sound of Sarah crying softly. They spent another hour going through the rest of the files. Photos of his father with his unit, smiling and confident and whole. Medical reports documenting the long road to recovery that never quite reached its destination. Letters from grateful soldiers and their families. Newspaper clippings about the school in Ramadi that had been successfully rebuilt, with a small mention of the soldiers who had protected the construction workers. In the very last folder, they found something that took David's breath away. A photo album labeled David in his father's handwriting. Inside were pictures David had never seen. His father at David's high school graduation, taken from a distance. His father outside the church where David got married, standing across the street. His father in the hospital parking lot the day David's daughter was born, looking to the window but never coming inside. His father had been there for all of it, watching from a distance, too ashamed or too scared to participate, but unable to stay away completely. The last photo in the album was taken just a few months ago. David and his family at his daughter's soccer game, with his father visible in the background, sitting alone in his truck, watching his granddaughter play. A granddaughter who had never met him, because David had made sure of that. David closed the album and looked around the basement one more time. This wasn't just storage space. This was a shrine to a life lived in service to others, to sacrifices made in silence, to love expressed in the only way a broken man knew how. "We have to tell people," Sarah said finally. "We have to make sure everyone knows who he really was." David nodded, but he was thinking about something else. He was thinking about the funeral, about the empty chapel, about the 37 people who had come to say goodbye to a man they barely knew. He was thinking about the soldiers who were still alive because of his father's actions, soldiers who might not even know that their savior had died alone and unrecognized. But mostly, he was thinking about his daughter, who would grow up never knowing her grandfather was a hero because David had been too proud and too stubborn to see it himself. That night, David called his daughter into his study. She was 8 years old, with Sarah's eyes and David's stubborn chin, and she had been asking questions about why they went to a funeral for someone she'd never met. "Emma," he said, "I want to tell you about your grandfather." He showed her the photos, the medals, the letters from grateful soldiers. He read her the citation for the Purple Heart, explaining in terms she could understand about brave soldiers and protecting people and doing the right thing even when it's hard. "Was he a real hero, Daddy?" she asked, holding the Purple Heart carefully in her small hands. "Yes, baby, he was a real hero, and I was too stupid to see it." Emma studied the medal for a long moment. "Can we visit his grave tomorrow? I want to tell him thank you." David's throat tightened, but he managed to answer, "Yes, we can do that." The next morning, David, Sarah, and Emma drove to Restwood Cemetery. The headstone was simple. Michael J. Thompson, 1955 to 2024, beloved father. No mention of his service. No indication that a hero was buried there. That would change. David had already called the Veterans Affairs office to arrange for a military headstone. He'd contacted the local VFW post to organize a proper memorial service. He'd reached out to the soldiers whose letters he'd found, many of whom hadn't known that their sergeant had died. But first, he had something to say. Standing at his father's grave with his daughter's hand in his, David spoke the words he'd never been able to say when it mattered. "I'm sorry, Dad. I'm sorry I didn't understand. I'm sorry I wasn't there when you needed me. I'm sorry I let my pride keep me from knowing who you really were." Emma stepped forward and placed a small American flag beside the headstone. "Thank you for saving people, Grandpa," she said simply. "Daddy says you were very brave." David knelt down and placed the Purple Heart against the headstone. "Staff Sergeant Michael Thompson," he said, his voice steady despite the tears. "Hero of Ramadi, father, grandfather. I promise I'll make sure everyone knows." As they walked back to the car, Emma asked, Daddy, why didn't you know Grandpa was a hero? David thought about the question for a long moment. Sometimes, Emma, the people who love us most carry heavy burdens to protect us from pain. Your grandfather thought he was protecting me by keeping his story secret. But he was wrong about that, just like I was wrong about him. Are you sad you didn't know him better? Yes, baby. I'm very sad about that. But I'm going to make sure you know all about him, and I'm going to make sure his story doesn't stay secret anymore. The memorial service 3 weeks later filled the same chapel that had been nearly empty for the funeral. Over 200 people came, veterans, active duty soldiers, families of the men his father had saved, and neighbors who learned for the first time that the quiet man on Maple Street had been a decorated war hero. David gave a eulogy. He talked about heroism and sacrifice, about the wounds that don't show in the battles fought in silence. He talked about a father's love expressed in the only way a broken man knew how, through distance and silence, and the hope that his son would be strong enough to succeed without him. But mostly, he talked about forgiveness. The forgiveness his father had needed but never asked for, the forgiveness David wished he'd offered while there was still time, and forgiveness that comes sometimes when it's too late to matter to anyone but the living. My father died believing he had failed me, David said, looking out at the packed chapel. But he was wrong about that, just like I was wrong about him. He didn't fail me. He showed me what courage looks like when no one's watching, what sacrifice means when there's no recognition, what love sounds like when it's too proud to speak its own name. He paused, looking down at his daughter in the front row, holding Sarah's hand and wearing a small pin with her grandfather's military unit insignia. Staff Sergeant Michael Thompson saved 8 soldiers in a bombed-out school in Ramadi, Iraq. But his greatest act of courage was coming home and living with the weight of that day for 19 years, carrying scars he never showed and fighting battles he never talked about, all because he thought it would protect the people he loved. David's voice broke slightly, but he continued. I spent 35 years angry at my father for being weak. I was wrong. He was the strongest man I've ever known. And I hope that somewhere, somehow, he knows that his son finally understands what it means to be a hero. The chapel was silent, except for the quiet sound of people crying. In the back row, an older man in a crisp dress uniform stood and began to clap. Others joined him, until the entire chapel was on its feet, applauding a man who had died thinking he was forgotten, for sacrifices that had gone unrecognized for too long. After the service, David was approached by a man about his own age wearing an army dress uniform with the insignia of a full colonel. Mr. Thompson, the man said, I'm Colonel James Wilson. I wrote to your father every year. David recognized the name from one of the letters. You were there that day. In Ramadi, I was a lieutenant then, fresh out of West Point, scared out of my mind. Your father saved my life. Literally carried me out of that building when I was too hurt to walk. Wilson reached into his jacket and pulled out a folded flag. This flew over our base in Iraq. I've been carrying it for 19 years, waiting for the right time to honor your father. I think that time is now. David accepted the flag with trembling hands. Thank you. He would have been honored. Mr. Thompson, Wilson said, there's something else you should know. That school in Ramadi, it's still there, still operating. Over 3,000 Iraqi children have gotten an education there because your father and his men protected the people who built it. His sacrifice had meaning. It had impact. He saved more than just 8 soldiers that day. David nodded, unable to speak. One more thing, Wilson continued. We've been talking, the survivors from that day, and we want to establish a scholarship fund in your father's name for children of veterans struggling with PTSD. We think he'd like that. Yes, David managed. He would like that very much. That evening, David sat in his father's basement, surrounded by the photos and medals and letters that told the story of a hero he'd never known. Emma was curled up beside him, looking through the photo album her grandfather had kept of her family. Daddy, she said, I wish I could have met him. Me too, baby. But you know what? I think he's watching us now, and I think he's happy that we finally know his story. Will you tell me more stories about him? David looked around at the walls covered with photographs of young soldiers in a faraway desert, at the medals earned through blood and courage, at the letters from grateful men, who owed their lives to a father David had never really known. "Yes," he said, "I'll tell you every story I can find. And when you're older, we'll visit that school in Iraq, and you can see what your grandfather helped protect." Emma smiled and snuggled closer. "I think he was the best grandfather ever, even if I never met him." David kissed the top of her head and thought about second chances, about the stories that remain untold until someone has the courage to look for them, about the heroes who walk among us carrying invisible wounds and silent sacrifices. His father had been wrong about many things, but he'd been right about one. David was strong enough to carry the weight of the truth. He was strong enough to honor a legacy he'd almost lost forever. And he was strong enough to make sure that his daughter would grow up knowing exactly what kind of man her grandfather had been. Staff Sergeant Michael J. Thompson, hero of Ramadi, keeper secrets, father, grandfather, finally home.